Good evening and welcome you all for the teaching program through EuroLearn. EuroLearn is an initiative to teach the postgraduates and fellow urologists who are keen to learn newer things in urology. The first one we have done a physical program on structural urethra. Dr. Seshumohan has done one program. This is the second program through EuroLearn. And in this program, we have selected a very interesting topic which is very useful to the postgraduates, contrast agents in urology. This is a subject which is frequently asked in your theory and practical examination. So all the postgraduates are supposed to know what contrast agents we are using, intravenous, intraluminal, what are ionic, what are non-ionic, what are high osmolar, what are low osmolar agents, what are their side effects, because there are very practical points and there certain things may not be given in books. And today Dr. Seshumohan is going to cover in detail about the contrast agents in urology. And I hope this will be a very useful program for postgraduates, not only for their theory, but also for their practical exams. Now I request Dr. Seshumohan to start his presentation on contrast agents in urology.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words. The topic chosen for today is contrast agents in urology and their adverse effects. So, sir already said this is a part of our EuroLearn initiative. I thank Surabhaka sir for constantly supporting me for doing this academic activity. The topic is more of a radiology and nephrology topic. As a urologist, we should know basics and basics about contrast agents, which questions can be asked commonly in theory as well as in practicals. So, I'll start the presentation now. So at a glance, I'm going to discuss regarding introduction and classification of contrast agents, clinical pharmacology of the various contrast agents available, their adverse reactions, particularly about contrast-induced nephropathy and nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, something about ultrasound agents and their adverse reactions, and a take-home message finally. So introduce what is a contrast agent. It is any substance that renders an organ or a structure more visible than it is possible without its addition. That means any structure which will opacify a structure, that is a contrast agent. What are the features of an ideal contrast agents? So as we know, there is no ideal in the nature. So here also there are many features which should be present for a contrast agents, but ideal contrast agent is not yet found. So the ideal properties are, it should be safe, non-toxic, it should not cross blood-brain barrier, it should have similar properties when compared to the blood, it should opacify the tissue, it should have low surface tension, it should be easy for injectability, and it should be easily eliminated from the body, and it should be cost effective as well. The other features are, it should be highly water soluble, should have low viscosity, that is non-antigenic, that means that should not react any reactions, there should be heat and chemical stable, persistence for sufficient time so that we can take the various radiographs, and it should have diffuse absorptive power from the tissues, thereby producing different photographs of different tissues. It should not impair physiological homeostasis, and it should be readily available, and patient's acceptance should be there, and there should not be any osmotic effects. These all are ideal characteristics of a contrast agents. So then classification, they are classified into various types like positive contrast agents and negative, monomeric, dimeric, ionic, non-ionic, HOCM, high osmolar, isoosmolar, low osmolar, and oil-based contrast agents, water-soluble agents, and powder-based agents. And agents by renal excretion, agents by hepatic excretion. The example for hepatic excretion is hypanoic acid, which is the only one agent which is excreted by liver. What is a positive agent and what is a negative agent? Here we can see negative agent, that means we use air, oxygen, CO2, and nitrous oxide. In this image, we can see negative agent, it will not opacify much as compared to the positive contrast agent. There is a difference between positive and negative agents. So for positive agents are barium used for GIT, iodine for various intravenous routes. So what is oil or oily based contrast agents? These were used previously, but now we are not using this. These are mainly used for lymphangiographic studies and myelographic studies. Example are iofentilate, lipoidrol. The complication with this is, as these are oil based agents, fat embolism risk is there. So next, how to classify iodinated contrast agents? ICAR, that is high osmolar agents, or low osmolar agents, or isoosmolar agents. So among high osmolar agents, they will have high osmolality, that is around 1200 to 2000. Example is diatrozoate or imidodiatrozoate, that is urographene, which we commonly use, and metrizoate, iothalamate. These are the common high osmolar contrast agents. As these are high osmolar, reactions are more with these high osmolar agents. So these high osmolar agents are ionic monomers. So next comes low osmolar agents. Among these are two types. One is ionic monomer, ionic dimer, and non-ionic monomers. So ionic dimer are a recent development. These are recent contrast agents, which example is ioxalate, which is 500 to 600 milliosmoles in osmolarity. Other one is non-ionic monomers. So example is iohexol, that is omnipaque, which we commonly use in CT scan or IVP studies. So other agents for non-ionic monomers are iopamidol, iomeprol, ioversal, iopramide. So if no need to remember all the things, if we able to remember this iohexol, that is enough. Iohexol is the most common agent which we use in CT scan and IVP. That is a non-ionic monomer and it is a low osmolar contrast agent. We use only low osmolar agents because these are safe. The other latest generation of contrast agents is IOCM, that is isoosmolar contrast agents. Example is iodixanol, that is Visipaque. Wherever the patient creatinine is in borderline, in those cases we use this iodixanol, that is Visipaque. So here to again summarize, agents are classified based on high osmolar, low osmolar, and isoosmolar. Other classification is monomer, dimer. Monomer are based again ionic monomers, ionic dimers. Non-ionic are non-ionic monomers, non-ionic dimers. So there are different classification systems used previously. So one is most commonly used is DHR classification. This is based on the nature of the material, that is whether it is iodine based or non-iodine based. The other classification is whether it is a water soluble or oil soluble. So the classification, whether it is the same as I already discussed, monomer or dimer, ionic or non-ionic. So whatever flowchart I have given in the previous slide, that is DHR classification. So these are the various classifications, the old classification system where they used to classify into three types, that is barium sulfate agents and oil-based agents and iodine-based agents. So we need to remember the DHR classification and the main flowchart. So this is regarding some of the important points. That is, we'll discuss first ionic, then we'll go to non-ionic. So ionic agents are two types, ionic monomers and ionic dimers. So monomer itself indicates it will have 3 atoms of iodine. If the monomer, if we double the monomers, then we can get the dimer. That is, the dimers will have 6 atoms of iodine. The importance of this iodine atoms is as the number of iodine atoms increasing, the radio opacity will also increase. That means ionic dimers, they will have 6 atoms of iodine. That means the radio opacity is better with dimers. Whereas we come to the monomers, this will have 3 iodine atoms. So this may not get opacification as compared to dimers, but this will have less side effects and these are reasonably cheaper as compared to dimers. There is a reason we are using non-ionic monomer, that is iohexol. The other important point is iodine to particle ratio. We can see particle ratio means if an ion is dissociated, it will create 2 anions. That means it will divide into 2 particles. One has anion, one has cation. So non-ionic will not dissociate. So they will have only 1 particle. So ionic will have 2 particles, non-ionic will have 1 particle. That means if there is more of iodine particle ratio, those contrast agents will have less side effects. For example, we can see an ionic dimer. Dimer means 6 iodine and this is ionic. So it will divide into 2. That is, it will have 3:1 or 6:2. As compared to that, we can see here non-ionic dimer, that is iotrolol. This will have 6 iodine atoms. And yes, this is non-ionic, this will not dissociate. So it will form only 1 particle. That means highest radio opacity and low complications are with this non-ionic dimers. So this is a chart given from Campbell. The important thing is the majority of the contrast agents, they will contain iodine of around 300 mg per dl per ml. So to summarize from this, all high osmolar agents are ionic monomers only. So all isoosmolar are non-ionic dimers only. So best to use is low osmolar agent, that is non-ionic or isoosmolar. The best one is among these two is isoosmolar, because this isoosmolar, the rate is much higher than compared to low osmolar. We commonly use low osmolar agents. But whenever there is renal compromise or borderline creatinine, best agents are isoosmolar contrast agents. So clinical pharmacology, all agents share similar functional group, that is triiodinated benzene ring. So iodine is important as it has a role in attenuation of X-rays. When the X-rays are attenuated, then only the tissue is opacified. So the iodine has this feature. That's the reason iodine is used as contrast agent. So regarding iodine, the atomic number is 53, atomic weight is 127, total body iodine content is around 50 milligrams. It provides radio opacity. So apart from iodine, we can add other elements which will act as carriers. So why iodine is only preferred? Because it has high contrast density because of its high atomic number. it will firmly bound to benzene ring. That's why the solubility is, I mean, it is not so easily soluble. And it will have low toxicity because the bondage with iodine is more, so it will not dissociate easily. That's the reason it will have greater opacity and less complications. So this is the important diagram which can tell everything about the contrast agent. That is, this is the single benzene ring. So if the agent is having single benzene ring, it is a monomer. If the agent is having two benzene rings, it is a dimer. There are various regions, the 2, 4, 6. These are the regions where iodine is bound. There are other regions like R1, R2, R3. If there is a carboxyl group which is bound at the level of R1 in case of monomer, or R1A region in case of dimer. If carboxyl group, that is minus COO, if it is bound at the level of R1 or R1A, then the agent is ionic compound. That means it will dissociate. When the other compounds, when the other compounds, they will attach at the level of R2, R3, then it is a non-ionic compound. The important thing is, if the carboxyl group is present at the level of R1, then it is ionic agent. If there is no carboxyl compound, then it is non-ionic agent. So iodine agents, they are firmly bound. This, I already told, this will help in increasing the opacity and decreasing the complications, which I already explained. So ionic agents, because those are negatively charged agents, so they are commonly bound with some cations like sodium and calcium. So sodium, calcium, and meglumine, which is responsible for the main reactions which are occurring because of the ionic agents is because of the additives like these anions like sodium and meglumine. So sodium and meglumine are the responsible for reactions which we commonly see with ionic agents. So these charged ions, that is the sodium and meglumine, they disrupt the electronic potential of cell membrane according further increasing toxicity. So ionic monomers, important thing is ionic monomers, as these have weak ability, because monomers will have only 3 iodine atoms and these are ionic. So this will have weak association, so weak solubility. So they are not so easily strongly bond with iodine, benzene ring. So this can easily dissociate. This will have less contrast ability. So for this reason, we need to give in higher concentration. Ionic monomers, because of their low visibility, we need to give in higher concentration, which will make them high osmolar agents. So nothing but high osmolar agents are ionic monomers, because they cannot opacify tissues in lower doses. We need to give higher doses. With higher doses, there is higher osmolarity increase. So that's the reason they became high osmolar agents. So all agents are low in protein binding. So distribution is immediately after giving into the circulation, they will easily circulate and they will quickly circulate into the agents, into the tissues which are having high blood supply, like brain, liver, kidney, they will go immediately, almost immediately. Whereas into fat and bone, this will go much slowly. So half-life of many of these agents is around 2 to 5 minutes. So majority of these agents, they will not undergo any metabolism in the body, and almost 99% are excreted by the kidneys only. So elimination half-life of most of these agents is 90 to 120 minutes in normal renal function. So whereas in case of renal functional disturbance, this half-life will prolong. That means it will take much longer time. So intravenous contrast, we coming to intravenous contrast administration, which is very common mode which we give. There are two types. It is of intra-arterial or intravenous. Intra-arterial is most commonly what we use in cardiac patients or vascular studies. Intravenous is what we use for other studies. So for intra-arterial injection, the important thing is we need to opacify only blood vessels. That's the reason there is no need to give high concentration. If you are able to give the little amount of contrast with rapidity, because the contrast will go into circulation within seconds. So if you want to delineate the arteries, arterial system, then we need not to give higher doses. Just the thing is, we need to give the contrast at a rapid speed. There is the concept behind the intra-arterial injection. And these intra-arterial injection, as they will pass very quickly, we need to take the images immediately. Whereas if you want to opacify the tissues, like in case of parenchymal enhancement, the first thing what we do in routine CT is, first there is arterial phase that will be within seconds, 5 to 10 seconds. Then that agent will go into the parenchymal tissues. So it will take some time, 10 to 20 seconds for the tissues to enhance. So there's a reason after 20 to 30 seconds, we are able to see nephrogenic or corticomedullary phase in case of CT urography. So when we want to delineate only the parenchymal structure, like solid organ structure, the thing is then the contrast need to opacify there. It need to be retained there for some time. The important thing here is the rapidity of injection is not required. If you want to see the solid organs, the most important thing is to visualize the solid parenchymal organs, the contrast agent should be more in quantity. To visualize the arterial system, the quickness of the contrast injection is important. Whereas to opacify the solid organs, the contrast quantity is very important. So the factors which are involved in contrast medium enhancement, there are different factors like patient related factors, CT scan related factors, contrast medium related factors. That means the patient factors, the patient weight, height, target and which we need to opacify, these are also important. And the patient cardiovascular status, access status, these all are important. The CT factors like CT duration, what is the scan delay, what is the time delay, and how we are giving the contrast agent. We are giving it whether test bolus or bolus tracking by method, or multiple phase CTs available, are 64 slice CTs there, are 32 slice CTs there. All these factors will influence the enhancement of the contrast agents. So there are some factors like contrast medium, like what agents we are using, iodinated, non-iodinated, high osmolar, low osmolar. All these factors are important in contrast medium enhancement. And the injection pattern, whether we are giving uniphasic means single bolus injection. Biphasic means we'll give some contrast, we'll wait for some 10 to 20 seconds, then again we'll give the second bolus. That is biphasic mode of giving contrast. So excretion, as I told, majority of the contrast agents, 99% they excrete by the kidneys. So whereas the important point to remember here is when there is large amount of contrast agent, when we are giving the large amount of contrast agents, once it is filtered from glomerulus, as because of this hyperosmolarity, it will try to pull the water into the renal tubules. There is a reason there is more chance of dehydration with the large amount of contrast agents. So the important thing is if the patient is already dehydrated, because of this large amount of contrast agents, the further dehydration will increases. And the renal tubules are damaged. They may cause tubular damage and there is chance of ATN and patient may develop into CIN. That is the most important thing. The thing is importance of dehydration, preventing dehydration, or importance of maintaining hydration. Because patient, well hydrated patient, there will not be any damage to the kidneys. So the whatever contrast we give within 10 minutes, 12% will get excreted by the kidneys. Within 1 hour, 50% will get excreted. Within 3 hours, 83% will get excreted. Within 24 hours, nearly 100% will get excreted. So less than 1% of contrast is excreted by the other routes like liver and small intestine. Whereas the patient, suppose the patient is renal compromised, the patient is already compromised renal function, then liver will take over the function of excreting the iodine agent. So adverse reactions between the ionic and non-ionic, as I told, ionic will have more adverse reaction, because the simple remember, ionic will have more reactions. So the thing is, with ionic agents, there is more thermal effect, there is more pain, more nausea, vomiting, toxicity to the kidneys also more, tissue necro is also more, extravasation occur. So other allergy, so every reaction is more with ionic contrast agent. So there are some additional modifications to decrease toxicity, like if you are adding calcium ions to the contrast agent, this will decrease the cardiac toxicity. When we maintain the neutral pH, there are less chance of vasodilatation. So these are the common contrast agents what we use, that is Omnipaque, that is iohexol. It is, as already told, iohexol is a common agent which we use in CT and IVP, which we can even use for RG-MCUG. So this is an agent, this is a low osmolar contrast agent, and this is a non-ionic monomer. Because it is a reasonably at lower cost, we are using this non-ionic and monomer. This is, so this is, I already told, this is iodixanol, that is isoosmolar agent. Whenever the patient renal function is a bit compromised, then we can use this agent, that is iodixanol, that is, it is a dimer, that is non-ionic dimer. So this is the latest, latest contrast agent which is developed. So its MRP 3070 rupees iodixanol, whereas MRP of this Omnipaque is around 3000 rupees. So next is urografin, which we commonly use in RGPs, RGU, and even for MCUG we use this. So previously we were using this for IVP also, but we are not using now because of adverse effects. I already told, urografin is a high osmolar contrast agent. There are more chance of adverse reactions. So urografin comes as 76% and 60% solutions. What is this 76 and what is this 60% is? Because based on this composition of these salts, that is urografin is a combination of meglumine amidotriazide and sodium amidotriazide. Whereas this 76% will have 66% of meglumine and 10% of sodium. Whereas this 60% will have 50% of meglumine and 10% of sodium. So based on these percentages, we can call it 76% or 60%. We use 76% agent only. So it can be a urografin available as 20 ml ampule, 50 ml ampule, whereas this Omnipaque is available as 100 ml ampule. So whereas various bolus techniques, how we can give the contrast agents. The most common previously used thing is direct by hand bolus. This is hand bolus technique. This is mechanical bolus technique with the help of this instrument. And this is what we commonly use in almost in every center. This is used, that is power injector. This power injector is a machine which will have we can adjust the settings here at what rate we want to give the contrast agents. And at the end of the contrast agent, we used to give saline also to flush the contrast. So this is a place, this is the area where the contrast is already loaded. From here, we can give the contrast. At the end of the contrast, saline is flushed from here. So we can see here the contrast agent is loaded already here. This is power injector. This is what we commonly use. So there are some technical issues like during giving contrast agent, it is better to have patients cooperation because it is always anxiety. More patients who are anxious, there are more chance of having adverse effects. The patient is anxious, there is more chance of extravasation also. Patient may, because of the patient movements. If the patient reports pain or sensation of swelling, then we have to immediately stop the contrast agents. So it's always better to use by power injector because we have control and with fixed amount of contrast agents, we can give the contrast. So, and the other important thing is flow rate is also important. If you have the most commonly for CT imaging, we use either from 3 ml per second or 5 ml per second of contrast agent. That means for almost 5 to 10 seconds, depending on our need. If you want to do only CT renal angiography, then the contrast agent is given for little amount and for little quantity. If you want to do CT urography, or if you want to see the kidneys like triphasic CT, then more amount of contrast should be given for more duration. Then it will opacify all the tissues. So depending on our need, whether we can use 3 ml per second flow rate or 5 ml per second flow rate, it's always better to use larger bore cannula for giving contrast agents. So better veins are antecubital vein or forearm veins. If we want to give more peripheral veins, then contrast rate should be low down. Always after giving contrast agent, give saline at the end. So then this is basics regarding contrast agent. Then we'll come to the adverse reactions one by one. So adverse reactions are very common. These are negligible with the recent contrast agents, whatever available, the reactions are very less. These are less than 1% to say. So gadolinium will also have a contrast reaction that is even very lower than compared to iodine agents. So as already told, low osmolar agents are better. Toxicity of the contrast agents is mainly because of factors which may not be related to the contrast agents or because of hyperosmolality, because of chemotoxic nature, or because of immunological reaction also. So the reactions which are due to osmolarity of the contrast agents, if suppose there is hyperosmolar agents we are using, then it will cause endothelial damage, erythrocyte damage, thrombosis, thrombophlebitis, damage to blood-brain barrier, vasodilatation, vascular pain, and hypervolemia. So reactions due to chemotoxicity, like these chemotoxicity mean directly because of sodium or meglumine. These sodium or magnesium or meglumine, they cause damage to the neurons, myocardium, endothelium, RBCs, and kidneys. The nephrotoxicity because of directly due to contrast agents. They may decrease the renal perfusion. They may cause glomerular injury, which manifests as proteinuria, tubular injury due to osmolarity or chemotoxicity or ischemia. So contrast media, they precipitate TAM phosphoproteins in the renal tubules. That's the reason they block the tubules and their tubular damage also occurs. So then the immunological reaction, the thing important to remember is these immunological reactions which are occurring after contrast agents, these are not anaphylactic reactions. These are anaphylactide reactions. These are like almost like allergic reactions, but these are not reactions because for allergic reaction, there should be prior exposure to the agent should be there. Whereas in case of this contrast, there may not be always a prior exposure. So for the basic reasons for these immunological reactions could be, one is histamine release. Second one is inactivation of enzymes, especially ACE and C1 esterases. ACE is enzyme, as we all know, is ACE enzyme. It will deactivate the bradykinin, which is elevated immediately after contrast agent injection. So these agents, they may cause damage to the endothelium, whereby they will incite the inflammatory cascades like coagulation complement system. So, and the important thing is there is inhibition of cholinesterases after giving contrast agents. So when there is inhibition of cholinesterase, there is increased level of acetylcholine. So these acetylcholine will cause more vagal stimulation, and this is the reason for more of vasovagal attacks seen with contrast agents. So reactions which are unrelated to media, that means these are not related to contrast media, but may occur like fever, pyrogenic reactions because of IL-2 or TNF alpha. And there may be hypertensive attacks in case of the patient is pheochromocytic. So because of the fear and anxiety of the patient, there may be limbic system activation, which is responsible for nausea, vomiting, vasovagal reactions, and temperature elevation. So these are the main classification of adverse reaction, which is given in Campbell. So I'll tell you how to remember it easily. reactions are mainly three types: mild reactions and moderate reactions and severe reaction. Just remember, mild, moderate, severe. And these reactions are of two types: allergic-like symptoms and physiological symptoms. So allergic-like symptoms is, I already told, these are not allergy symptoms because there is no exposure of prior contrast agents. So these are almost features similar to an allergic reaction. That is the reason they call it as allergic-like. Then what is physiological? That means these are not related to the contrast agent. These are the normal physiological response which our body gives to a foreign body like a contrast agent. So these are different from this. So for mild symptom, just remember there are 3 to 4 components. One is allergic, like that is urticaria, and second thing is throat irritation or respiratory symptom like nasal congestion, sneezing. In case of mild reaction, there is limited urticaria, limited edema, limited throat irritation, nasal congestion, sneezing. Whereas in case of moderate reaction, so limited urticaria will become diffuse urticaria, diffuse reaction, diffuse edema, and there is facial edema, throat tightness, wheeze or bronchospasm. Whereas in case of severe reaction, the same thing: diffuse edema, laryngeal edema with bronchospasm, and anaphylactic shock may also occur very rarely. So coming to physiological response, normally for mild reaction, there is mild physiological response like limited nausea, limited vomiting, limited headache, mild hypertension. Whereas in case of moderate symptom reactions, there will be protracted nausea, vomiting, more hypertension, more vasovagal attacks. Whereas in case of severe reaction, like more vasovagal reaction which is resistant to treatment, there may be arrhythmias, there may be seizures, and there may be even hypertensive emergency. Is the main important is right just to, for example, for the PG students who want to write in exam. So basically it is 3 types: mild reactions, moderate reactions, severe reactions, allergic, like, physiological, in the 3 types. So as already told, what is allergic like reaction? This is the table. This is anaphylactic or allergy like reaction. This is anaphylactic reaction. For anaphylaxis, we need to have a prior sensitization. The reaction can occur immediately after second dose. Here it is not required. So almost features are similar to like an allergy reaction, but the thing is it is not, patient will not be sensitized here previously, and this is not IgE mediated, whereas allergic reactions are IgE mediated. This is the only difference. So yeah. Then treatment of contrast agent reaction. Most of the reactions are rare, but require treatment. The majority of the reactions are mild to moderate only. The very rarely patient will develop severe reactions. So before treating the patient, we need to evaluate the patient. For an evaluation, we need to see his general appearance, ability to speak, whether he's able to, what is his respiratory status, what is his pulse rate and BP. Then they will come to the treatment one by one: mild reactions treatment, moderate reaction treatment, severe reaction treatment. The mild reaction, we all know most of the times these don't require any treatment, just mild reassurance, and if at all required, we can give the oral tablets or oral tablets in the form of like diphenhydramine, which is like that is component of a Benadryl cough syrup, which we commonly, that is diphenhydramine. We can give it oral syrup, or if it is not responding, then we can give CPM tablets or injection, diazepam to alleviate the anxiety symptoms. If patient is having any amount of bronchospasm, then we can give the oxygen mask and we can give the beta agonist inhalation puffs. So if the patient is having moderate symptoms, then we can add hydrocortisone and beta inhalational puffs. If the patient is having moderate to severe, if the patient is progressed from moderate to severe, then we can add epinephrine injection. Then treatment of severe reactions. This severe life-threatening reactions are very rare. These are most commonly with high osmolar agents, I already told. So for these patients, immediate treatment is required. The patient usually requires multimodal treatment in case of emergency support from the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. So the important drug here is epinephrine. We need to, in emergency situation, in severe reactions, the drug is epinephrine. So epinephrine can be given in IM or IV form. Just try to remember this IV form. IV form dilution is 1 in 10,000. That means 1 ml of epinephrine in 9 ml of saline. That is into 10 cc. We can take 9 ml of saline plus 1 ml of this epinephrine. It will equal to 1 in 10,000 dilution. The dosage is 0.1 ml or 0.01 mg per kg. So we can give 1 ml from the 10 cc reconstruction. We can give 1 ml at a frequency of 5 to 10 minutes. The maximum dose we can give is 1 mg. That is, maximum dose we can give is 1 vial. So important point here is, before giving epinephrine, we need to see whether the patient is already on beta blockers or not. As the patient with beta blockers, there is unopposed alpha action because already beta are blocked. So this is epinephrine is alpha agonist. So the patient may have more of alpha effects leading to hypertension and angina. So how we can know whether the patient is having this hypotension, the features are because of anaphylaxis or because of beta blockers. The patient is having hypotension with tachycardia, it is because of anaphylactic reaction. The patient is having bradycardia, that means patient is definitely using beta blockers. So epinephrine should be used very cautiously in these patients. The patient is having bradycardia, then we should think before giving epinephrine. So how to treat this hypotension? We know for hypotension we need to give 0.9% NS or RL. We need to resuscitate the patient with fluids and oxygen. The patient is not responding, then we can add dopamine. So regarding pre-medication, there is no pre-medication, no known pre-medication which will eliminate the risk of reactions. So there are many pre-medication agents are tried like corticosteroids, antihistaminics, and ephedrine. So the thing is, these pre-medication, if at all you want to give, they should be given 12 to 24 hours before. So there are two strategies available for treating this for pre-medication. There are two protocols which we need to remember. One is Greenberger protocol and second one is Lazar protocol. These protocols are for patients who are electively posted for any contrast agent study. So just the ideal of the Greenberger regimen is we need to give prednisolone plus diphenhydramine, whereas the Lazar protocol, here we can give methylprednisolone with diphenhydramine. In Greenberger protocol, the prednisolone, that is 50 mg of oral tablet, that should be given 13 hours before, 7 hours before, and 1 hour before the contrast study, plus diphenhydramine 50 milligrams IV IMR oral 1 hour before the study. This is prednisolone and Greenberger protocol. Whereas the Lazar protocol, he used methylprednisolone, that is 32 milligram methylprednisolone 12 hours before and 2 hours before the study, plus diphenhydramine 50 mg 1 hour before the study. Suppose if the patient is in emergency, then the protocol is a bit different. That is, emergency situation, the treatment is given by Greenberger protocol only. In emergency situation, instead of prednisolone, we'll give methylprednisolone, that is 40 milligrams, 4 hours before the contrast study. And diphenhydramine as the same. So the important thing to remember is the patient is for elective procedure or emergency procedure. For elective procedure, we can give prednisolone or prednisolone plus diphenhydramine for Greenberger protocol, or methylprednisolone for Lazar protocol. So if the patient is not able to take prednisolone oral tablets, then we can give 200 mg of hydrocortisone injection. So the patient came in like there is emergency procedure with emergency investigation, emergency CT is required in a patient with within 1 hour or very short period. Then what we can do? These whatever mentioned pre-medication are before given at least for 4 to 6 hours, or they should be given started 12 hours before. For example, if the patient does not give us time, if the patient want to give the pre-medication within 1 hour or 2 hours, then there are some protocol, that is this called as accelerated IV pre-medication. That means this should be given within very short period of time. So the agents here are methylprednisolone or hydrocortisone with diphenhydramine or dexamethasone also we can add. So the agents are same, almost the dose, the timing is different. Methylprednisolone or hydrocortisone with diphenhydramine or dexamethasone with diphenhydramine. So delayed reactions. So I forgot to tell you that definition for acute reaction is any reaction which is occurring within 1 hour, that is acute reaction. Any contrast reaction which is occurring after 1 hour, that is a delayed reaction. In some articles, some books they mention as after 3 hours, but in most of the people they mention as acute reaction is less than 1 hour, delayed reaction is more than 1 hour. That means 3 to 7 days. So these delayed reactions are present almost like acute reactions, like with mild symptoms only most of the times. They will resolve by themselves only. There are some issues, like if the patient is allergic to prior contrast agent. Suppose the patient was having prior reaction to any contrast agents, then if the patient is subjected for second study, then there is 5-fold increased risk of reaction second time. If the patient does not have any allergy to the prior contrast agent, then there is 2 to 3 times risk. The patient who is having iodine allergy, then there is no greater risk of iodine agent administration. There is no cross reaction between one class of contrast agent with other. That means adverse reaction to one agent may not be occur with the other class of contrast agent. Suppose anxiety, definitely as we discussed, patients who are more anxious, there are more chance of having adverse reaction, but there is no need to require any pre-medication. Whereas the patient with asthma, they will have more chance of having adverse reaction, but there is no need to pre-medicate them also. Patient with beta blockers I already discussed. So cardiac anomalies, patient with cardiac anomaly, there is increased chance of having adverse reaction, but pre-medication is not required because if it all occurs, the reactions all are mild reactions. Regarding hyperthyroidism, if the patient is a hyperthyroid patient, giving iodine agent in these patients may develop thyrotoxicosis. Whereas in patient with myasthenia gravis, pheochromocytoma, sickle cell trait, the role of contrast agents is controversial and pre-medication is not required in these cases. So what happens when there is extravasation of contrast material? So extravasation may appear at the time only, or it may manifest late. That means even after 24 to 48 hours also. It is mainly extravasation is because of hyperosmolarity of the contrast agents, and the symptoms of pain, swelling, all may be because of compartment syndrome, because of extravasation. So how to manage? Immediately we need to stop the contrast agents, and we need to notify the physician, and we need to consult the plastic surgeon. We need to elevate the limb, and we can even massage the limb to promote the drainage, and we need to follow up these patients thoroughly. This is a summary of all the whatever I told regarding the management issues. The patient is having mild reaction or moderate to severe reaction. The patient is having mild reactions, symptomatic relief. The patient is having moderate to severe symptoms. Then we need to see for the symptoms, like the patient is having skin reactions or lung symptoms. The patient is having skin reaction like urticaria, then we can have diphenhydramine with or without ephedrine. The patient is having lung symptoms like bronchospasm, then we have to add bronchodilators with ephedrine. So, and the patient is hypotension, then we need to improve the hydration status. So this is regarding general contrast agent reaction. Then we come to the CIN, that is contrast induced nephropathy. So there are two particular terminals we need to understand. One is PCAKI, that means post contrast acute kidney injury. Second one is contrast induced nephropathy. The difference here is any reaction which is occurring after contrast agents, whether it may be because of contrast agent or it may be because of any other reason, because of patient comorbids, then it is called as post contrast acute kidney injury. The patient's reactions are, if we are proven to be because of contrast agent only, then we should coin the term contrast induced nephropathy. But the thing is, both the terms can be used as interchangeably. So these contrast agent reactions may occur because of many various pathologies, most commonly because of vasoconstriction of the renal vessels, direct tubular toxicity, osmotic mechanisms, and chemotoxic mechanism. So in gadolinium based contrast agents, usually they don't cause CIN, but the thing is, if we use higher doses as approved by FDA, these gadolinium contrast agents cause more damage as compared to iodinated contrast agents. So this is a flowchart to show how contrast media is causing reactions. The mechanism is multifactorial. Like this, the contrast agent may cause direct cytotoxicity, it may cause direct endothelial damage, and there may be a release of endothelins here. Because of all this, there may be vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction will lead to decreased medullary perfusion. Decreased medullary perfusion will lead to medullary ischemia and decreased GFR. And these contrast agents, because of their high osmolarity, there will be increase in viscosity. The increased viscosity will cause decreased perfusion and decreased flow. Finally, they are leading to decreased GFR and tubular damage. This is the other flowchart which is showing almost all the mechanisms involved in the CIN pathophysiology. That is, one is contrast agent, they may cause directly renal vasoconstriction. Because of this, there will be decrease in RBF, which may cause decrease in GFR and CIN. The second mechanism is there may be increased flow also sometimes. Because of this, increased viscosity, increased tubular pressure in the tubules, tubular obstruction because of deposition of the TAM hotspot proteins, and because of tubular obstruction, there is decrease in GFR. Other mechanism is changes in erythrocyte membrane skeleton, changes in endothelium, and changes in RBC membrane damage. This may lead to medullary hypoxia. This may lead to reactive oxygen species generation, which may cause tubular cell damage and decrease GFR. So how to diagnose? There are different classifications, different criteria to diagnose CIN. There is no definitive criteria based on which we can clearly define this CIN. The three definite criteria are Akin criteria, Rifle criteria, KDIGO criteria. Akin is acute kidney injury network criteria. Rifle is risk, injury, failure, loss, and ESRD. I will tell you one by one. So Akin definition is, so which Akin definition is given in Campbell. This is Akin definition is any reaction which is occurring within 48 hours of contrast agent administration with any of the following. That is, one is absolute increase in serum creatinine more than 0.3 mg per dl, or more than 50% increase in serum creatinine, or urine output which is less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour for at least 6 hours. These three are the features. If having any one of these features, it is defined as CIN as per Akin criteria. So as per Akin, they classify into type stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of CIN. That is RAKI. That is, stage 1 is more than 1.5 to 2 times rise in serum creatinine. Stage 2 is 2 to 3 times rise in serum creatinine. Stage 3 is more than 3 times raise in serum creatinine or less than 35 GFR, or if the patient is already started on renal replacement therapy. These are stage 1, 2, 3 of CIN or AKI. The second classification criteria is Rifle criteria. The Rifle criteria, just observe this image. Every point will tell regarding the progression of the contrast-induced nephropathy course and how we can predict the risk of kidney injury. In the Rifle criteria, the first R is risk. That means if the patient's serum creatinine is raised more than 1.5 times, if the GFR is decreased more than 25 times, there is chance of risk to the kidney. Second is injury. When there is definite chance of injury, means if the serum creatinine is more than 2 times elevation or the GFR decrease more than 50 times, 50%, then there is definitely chance of injury to the kidney. When the patient will go into failure, that means if the serum creatinine is more than 3 times, or if there is decrease in GFR more than 75%, or if there is serum creatinine rise of more than 4, or an acute rise of more than 0.5, that means that definitely the patient is going into failure. When the failure is persisted for more than 4 weeks, the patient will be almost there is complete loss of kidney function. When the complete loss of kidney function, if the patient is for more than 3 months, the patient will develop into ESRD. This is the progression for, and this is nothing but Rifle's criteria. The urine output criteria is almost same for all the contrast agents. This is KDIGO classification. KDIGO definition is almost similar to ECHIN. In ECHIN, they tell time duration is 48 hours, whereas in case of KDIGO, they mention the time duration of 7 days. That's the only difference between these two criteria. To summarize all these 3 criteria, these urine output features are common to all the 3 criteria, Rifle, ECHIN, and KDIGO. The one thing is, the stage 1 is less than 0.5 ml per kg of urine output for more than 6 hours. Stage 2 is less than 0.5 for more than 12 hours. Stage 3 is less than 0.3 for 24 hours or NURIA for more than 12 hours. These urine output features are same for 3 criteria. And as I told, the difference between ECHIN and KDIGO is time duration of definition. So here it is 48 hours and it is 7 hours, 7 days. So what are the risk factors in whom the patient will develop CIN? There are important 3 risk factors. There are many risk factors. The important are only 3 risk factors. Among these 3 are most important things. Patient's pre-existing renal insufficiency is the most important risk factor. The second is pre-existing diabetes mellitus and dehydration. And there are many other reasons which risk factors which can also cause CIN, like more of patient age, multiple myeloma, diuretics use, patient with hypertension, hypotension, or anemia with ejection fraction less than 40. So most common non-patient related causes of CIN is high osmolar use of high osmolar agent, use of ionic agent, increased contrast viscosity, multiple contrast studies performed within a short period of time. And when we are giving large volume of contrast agent, these are the factors which are non-patient related factors which give rise to CIN. So an important point is the patient, suppose the patient is already CKD patient is a ESRD patient when his kidney is not functioning. That means patient is anuric. If we give contrast agent in this patient, there is no additional damage which is going to happen. So we can safely give, we can easily give the contrast agent in this patient, and this patient may not require dialysis even after the procedure. That means that there is no fear of kidney damage. The kidneys are already damaged here. So the important thing is based on the patient eGFR status, risk of CIN can be predicted. That is, if the patient eGFR is more than 45, there is almost no risk of CIN. The patient eGFR is between 30 to 44, then there may be chances of CIN reactions are maybe there, or if at all occur, they are not severe. The patient eGFR is less than 30, then definitely contrast agent is an independent risk factor. So important thing is GFR less than 30, definite risk. More than 45 may not be a risk factor. So serum creatinine need not to be measured in all the patients. The American College of Radiology, they prescribed some of the risk factors group. In these patients only creatinine should be measured. The patient with more than 60 years, patient who are on a dialysis, kidney transplant patient with solitary kidney, renal cancer, renal surgery, hypertension, history of diabetes, metformin use. In these patients, it is before going to contrast agents, always advisable to measure the serum creatinine levels. So how to prevent? The only one preventive measure which is approved at present is hydrating the patient. That is 12 hours before the procedure, we need to hydrate the patient with 0.9% NS, that is 75 to 100 ml per hour. Followed by it should be continued 12 hours after the procedure also. So the sodium bicarbonate, NSL, cysteine, vitamin C, furosemide, all this has been tried previously, but there is no evidence for all these agents now. These are not at all indicated now. So there is one recent trial which is a game changer in this. That means previously you can see here N-acetyl cysteine was advised as a treatment modality in 2000 year. So in 2004 year, sodium bicarbonate was also advised as a treatment modality. So in 2011 there was a study, that is ACT trial. So it shows clearly that there is no use of N-acetyl cysteine in patient. So the PRESERVE study is recently done in this 2017-18. In this study, there is no clear benefit of sodium bicarbonate or N-acetyl cysteine, except for NS. There is no role of any other agent in treatment of CIN. So there is a risk prediction score. That means based on this score, we can predict which are the patient who may develop CIN. So these are the scoring system is known as Mehran risk score. So Mehran risk score, there are various factors like the patient is hypotensive. You need not to remember all these things, but just remember the name at least. The Mehran risk score is the patient is hypotension, then will give 5 score to the patient. The patient is on intra-aortic balloon pump, that is cardiac patient, score is 5. The patient is CHF patient, the score is 5. The patient age is more than 75, we'll give the score is 4. The patient is a diabetic, score is 3. Anemia 3. EGFR less than 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. Less than 20 EGFR, score is 6. EGFR 20 to 40, score is 4. EGFR 40 to 60, score is 2. Contrast agents, for 100 ml of each contrast agent we are giving, we can add 1 score. Based on these points, we can classify the patient into scores of total sum of less than 5 score, 6 to 10 score, 11 to 16 score, more than 16 score. That means less than 5 score is a low risk group, 6 to 10 is moderate risk group, 11 to 16 is a high risk group, more than 16 is very high risk group. The important of this stratification system is based on these risk stratification, we can pre-medicate the patient or we can take precautions. If possible, we can avoid the contrast agents which are of more toxic, and we can avoid other investigation which other alternate investigation like MRI or contrast agent ultrasound we can choose based on this risk stratification. This is known as Mehran risk score. So the dosage of N-acetyl cysteine, if someone asks, it is 1200 milligrams twice daily. So metformin, the important thing is majority of the patients are diabetic. The important thing is that in case of as metformin is excreted by the kidneys, in case of renal compromise, metformin is it will not excrete so easily. It will take time. So because of this, metformin will cause lactic acidosis. So this is known as biguanide acidosis or metformin-induced lactic acidosis. This will cause more reaction to the kidney. So that is the reason before the patient is already on metformin, it's better to stop the metformin at least 2 days before the study, and it can be started 2 days after the study. Then we'll come to the nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. Nephrogenic systemic fibrosis is also known as nephrogenic fibrosing dermopathy. Previously, it was thought that the gadolinium is responsible for all the dermatological changes, but it was kidney changes were not proven at the time. So once the kidney involvement is proven, then the term is changed to nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. So this is also known as gadolinium-based contrast agents induced reaction. So these reactions, nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, always occur in patients who are moderate to severe end-stage renal disease. So the mechanism here is mainly because of transmetallation. I will explain what is transmetallation. Because of the transmetallation, there is free gadolinium is available. So this is transmetallation. In the body, gadolinium is bound to the ligand, which is circulating as gadolinium ligand complex. Whereas when there is patient is renal compromised, there is elevation of phosphate levels and there is elevation of iron levels. When there is elevation of iron levels and phosphate levels, this will dissociate the gadolinium and ligand. This will separate the gadolinium from ligand. So there will be free gadolinium is available. This free gadolinium, when it is bound to phosphate, it will become gadolinium phosphate, which is insoluble. This means this insoluble gadolinium phosphate will not excrete from the kidneys. So it will be circulating in the body. It will deposit in various tissues. Because of this various deposition in the tissues, it is responsible for reactions, whatever we are seeing because of gadolinium. So this is transmetallation. This is nothing but transmetallation. This metal iron is replacing here the ligand and gadolinium complex. So because of this free gadolinium, it is deposited in different tissues and result in inflammation and fibrosis. Just try to understand how NS system fibrosis occurs. It's because of transmetallation, free gadolinium increase in free gadolinium deposit in different tissues, leading to inflammation, fibrosis. There is risk stratification. There is a risk triad. That means who are the patient who will develop NSF. Not all patients with ESRD will develop NSF. So if the patient is having one of these the three features, then these are the patients who will develop NSF. That is, the risk stratification is known as Sadowski risk triad. That means three features. One is exposure to gadolinium is must. Second is there should be a pro-inflammatory state in the body like any other comorbidities. And there should be renal impairment. That means GFR should be less than 30. So when these three are present, it is Sadowski risk triad. And these patients are at risk of NSF. So there are some triggering factors which will initiate or elicit the NSF development. So what are the triggering factors here are? One is dialysate fluid. If the patient is already dialysis, during even dialysate fluid may elicit this NSF. Use of erythropoietin, ACE inhibitors, hypercoagulable state, surgical or vascular procedures. And if there is an inflammation or infarcted tissue, it may also trigger the NSF. So the overall risk of NSF with gadolinium agent is 4.6%. So pathophysiology, there are three gadolinium-based contrast agents which are implicated in the development of gadolinium-based nephrosis system fiber. These are the three agents which are responsible for development of NSF. That is gadodiamide, gadopentetate, gadovarsetamide. So here is classification system for gadolinium-based contrast agents. These contrast agents are basically of two types, linear and macrocystic. Again, in linear, there is ionic and non-ionic. So example of ionic agent is gadopentetate, which we commonly use in almost in all center. That is Visiscan, Omniscan. The second one is non-ionic linear agent. These are gadodiamide. So gadopentetate and gadodiamide are the linear gadolinium contrast agents which are not safe. There are macrocystic, again, there are two types, ionic and non-ionic. Among the ionic macrocystic agents, it is gadoteridate. And among non-ionic macrocystic, it is gadoteridol. If you are able to remember these classification, it is better in this theory point. Other, if you, for practical point, there are safe and unsafe gadolinium agents. So there are all macrocystic agents. These are safe. You can see all the macrocystic agents. These are safe and these are most stable agents. They will not dissociate so easily. Whereas these linear agents, that is three, gadodiamide, gadopentetate, and gadovarsetamide. These three are unsafe contrast agents, gadolinium agents. But we are using commonly gadodiamide only because of easy availability. This is gadodiamide, that is Omniscan. It is available as 10 ml solution. Before giving a MRI contrast agent, we can give 10 ml directly, we'll push the contrast agent, then we can scan the target tissues. So how this macrocyclic gadolinium agents are safe, as already told, because these macrocyclic agents, the gadolinium is caged by a ligand. Whereas in case of linear agents, these are least stable because the bondage is not so strong in case of linear agent. That's the reason linear agents are not stable and not useful. There are different theories which are involved in development of NSF. Just I'll read the names, just try to, for theory purpose, I'm telling this. One is free gadolinium hypothesis, already explained. This is because of transmetallation of gadolinium, already explained. That is free gadolinium hypothesis. Second one is bioactive gadolinium hypothesis. Here is the gadolinium itself may incite inflammatory reaction. That is bioactive theory. Third one is circulating fibrocyte theory. Here it is because of gadolinium, there is expression of CD34, CD45. This will increase the TGF beta levels. This is responsible for all the reactions. So this is circulating fibrocyte theory, bioactive theory, free gadolinium theory. And there is other study, that is other theory, that is cumulative risk model developed by an Indian, that is Swaminathan study. Here they are telling that as the risk factors increases, the chance of NSF will increase. So the patient macrocystic agents are best. Ionic linear are second best. Non-ionic linear are most with complications. The patient is having other comorbidities, I already discussed, these are all the triggering factors, then there is increased chance of having risk of NSF. This is the risk model developed by Swaminathan. So what are the clinical features? Clinical features are mainly because of, I told you this, because of gadolinium is deposited in various tissues. Mainly they will have skin reactions, like there may be chance, there may be firm and red nodules may be seen, or there may be induration may be seen, or there may be purity orange changes, there may be fibrotic plaques may be seen. This is in early stages. Whether in case of later stages, contractures may develop. Here we can see this is in later stages. All these contractures will develop. And this NSF will also involve other solid organs like lungs, heart, eyes, diaphragm, liver, kidney. Almost every organ is involved except three organs. That is, face will not get involved in NSF. Antecubital fossa will not get involved. Popliteal fossa will not get involved. These are the three features which will differentiate the skin lesions from other lesions which have almost severe clinical dermatological manifestation. That means there are many skin lesions which are almost present like this. The differentiating points are no space lesions, no antecubital lesions, no popliteal lesions. These are the other changes like induration, here pudgy orange appearance, puckering of the skin, and there is sclerotic plaques in the eyes. So the investigation of choice with the gold standard investigation, as these changes are occurring in skin and dermal and epidermal levels, definitely it is based on biopsy only. As the gadolinium may even deposit even in muscles also. That is the reason most of the times incisional biopsy or deep biopsies are required. So microscopically, all the features of chronic inflammation will be there. Apart from this, there are sclerotic bodies are there, which are also known as elastocollagenous balls, which are characteristic of NSF. So there is, we can even see CD3 fibroblast in histopathology, and it is CD34 positive also. Even sometimes we can even see gadolinium molecules in histopathology also. So there are some investigation which will give a clue regarding diagnosis of NSF. That is immunoreactivity for CD34, CD45, and increased levels of procollagen levels, detection of gadolinium in the tissues, and impaired clearance of gadolinium GFR less than 30. If there are all these features are then we can suspect even NSF without biopsy. There is one classification, clinicopathological diagnostic criteria, that is known as Michael-Gerardi clinicopathological classification or criteria. Based on this only, they diagnose nephrotic systemic fibrosis based on clinical features and pathological features. So this is a table showing clinical features, which can be major criteria or minor criteria. No need to remember all this. There are histological features. If these are there, they will give different scoring systems. So clinical score is, see, if there is more than one major criteria I already told, there are having pattern plaques or joint contractures, cobblestone appearance, pudgy orange appearance, all this will come into major criteria. If the patient is having any one of this, there is high chance of having NSF. Whereas in case histologically, increased dermal cellularity, CD34 positivity, and collagen and thin and thick collagen bundles, all these features are there. Then histologically also we can score the patient. If the score is more, that means if the score is 4 in the both this, like clinical score and pathological score, histological score, the score is 4, then there is high chance of NSF. Here you can see in this way. Here is clinical score 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here is pathological score 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 score pathology and 4 score from clinical score. This will highly probable of diagnosis of NSF. Able to remember, just remember this for theory purpose. So diagnosis, there are no imaging studies which will clearly tell regarding the NSF, but if you do MRI, these lesions will appear as T1 hypointensity and T2 hyperintensity. And when we do bone scan, these lesions will have increased uptake on bone scan. So DD, there are many skin conditions which will appear like NSF. As I already told, the differentiating points here is no involvement of face, no involvement of cubital fossa, no involvement of popliteal fossa. So therapeutic modality, because these reactions are occur, they will not occur immediately. These NSF reactions may occur even days or months after the exposure to gadolinium-based agent. So there is no particular treatment which is available, which is recommended for NSF. These all are tried, like oral or topical steroids, pentoxifillins, plasmapheresis, photopheresis, psoralen therapy, immunoglobulins, IVIGs, sodium thiosulfate, and physical activity. The important thing is the better treatment modality is once we can treat his CKD, that means once we can once we do the transplant, most of the features they will revert back to some extent. That is the only treatment modality which is recommended. And the second thing is with the patient, whoever is of increased zone of having NSF, in those patients, if immediately after giving MRI with gadolinium study, if you do immediately dialysis, there is more chances of eliminate gadolinium from the system. So there are some non-gadolinium alternatives. When the gadolinium agent is not more of complication, then there are other agents which are non-gadolinium based, which can be tried for contrast media. That is, these are iron oxide based agent, that is ferrumoxitol, or manganese based agent. These are MnPyC3. These are investigation. This is under stage 3 level. This is investigational level. This we can try. So how to prevent? The only preventing agent is whenever possible, avoid usage of these agents in case when the patient's GFR is less than 30, or if you want to use, you can use macrocyclic agents. Other thing is performing dialysis immediately after the MRI examination is recommended for patient already in dialysis treatment, but there is no evidence for introducing dialysis in non-dialysis patients. This is the important point. When the patient is already on dialysis, we do MRI with contrast agent. There is role of doing immediately dialysis in these patients. So as we already know, that when the patient's GFR is less than 30, it's better to avoid. The patient's GFR is more than 60, we can give. So half-life of most of these gadolinium agents is more than 90 minutes in normal patient. When the patient who are CKD on with a compromised function, the half-life is increased to 20 folds. And the important thing is over 98% of gadolinium is eliminated after 3 sessions of hemodialysis session. That is an important point to remember. The patient whose EGFR is less than 30, whom we exposed for MRI with gadolinium contrast agents, if you do dialysis immediately, we can eliminate most of the gadolinium. We can decrease to most of the times NSF occurrence. So the important thing is the effect of hemodialysis will become significant only when it is initiated early and removes the gadolinium before it gets deposited in the tissues. Just try to remember this thing. Once we need to do anything before the gadolinium is fixed into the tissues. After that, we cannot do. All these changes will become irreversible after that. So this is a flow chart for management of NSF. The patient with risk factors, then we need to see whether the patient is having on dialysis or having any kidney injuries there or not. Then we need to see the patient renal function with comorbidities, like the patient is more than 60 years of age with diabetes, hypertension, history of renal disease. Then we need to measure his EGFR status. Based on EGFR status, if the EGFR is less than 30, then no point in doing MRI, try to avoid the agent. The EGFR is more than 60, then we can proceed with MRI study. The EGFR is 30 to 50%, then we try to avoid. If not possible, then we can use macrocyclic agents. So usual course. The prognosis of the nephrotic systemic fibrosis will depend on the extent of the lesions and severity of the lesions and the rapidity with which the complications are occurred. In most patients, the nephrogenic systemic fibrosis is a progressive condition, but in majority of the studies, they tried after transplantation, some of the changes have been reverted back. So then we come to the contrast agents which are used in ultrasound and their adverse effects. So contrast CUS, we already know, it is almost like IV contrast agents what we use in CT, but the thing is we use ultrasound here and we use intravenous microbubble containing contrast agents, which will they will enhance the tissues like any other CT IV study. So these micro bubbles, they will have a shell and a core. The shell is made up of the tissues like albumin, galactose, and lipid polymers. And the core is having micro bubbles. So the important thing is the shell is very important because the shell is responsible for how this microbubble is taken up by the system or different tissues. So echogenicity of the contrast agent is mainly based on gas core, but the stability of the agent is based on the shell. So these microbubbles, they are having a size of 1 to 4 micrometers. They are almost similar to size of an RBC. The thing is, we need to highlight the vasculature. Then we highlight to see the vascular structures. If the size is less, they will easily escape out of the circulation. That is the reason they are having size almost similar to that of RBC. So there are different microbubbles available. There are basically 3 types based on air or nitrogen, based on perfluorocarbon, based on sulfur hexafluoride. In India, SonoView is the ultrasound contrast agent which is widely available. It is based on sulfur hexafluoride, which is mainly used for liver, kidney, gynecological studies. So how they are available? SonoView is nothing but it is based on sulfur hexafluoride agent, microbubbles. So they will come as powder, and there is a shell component, that is we call it as galactose. In this case, galactose. In SonoView, there is a kit which is having one vial which is containing 25 ml of powder after reconstruction, and there is second vial which will have a suspension medium, that is galactose. When we combine both these things, the galactose will form a shell, and these sulfur hexafluoride powder will generate air bubbles. So these air bubbles are surrounded by a galactose shell, and this will enter into circulation. The usual dose for kidney is 1 ml. Procedure is immediately after reconstruction, the suspension should be used within 15 minutes. So we need to target the organ which we are concentrating. So if you want to concentrate on the kidneys, we need to on the B mode first. After we'll give the IV contrast agent, then we can change the mode to the contrast ultrasound, contrast enhanced setting. So once after this, based on this vascularity and the neovascularity, the tissue they can be enhanced into 3 different types. That is, the tissues can be of hyper enhancing, or it can be of iso enhancing or hypo enhancing. The malignancy, it will be hyper enhancing most of the times. So types that basically in a CUS of 2 types: non-target type and targeted type. Targeted type is we attach these microbubbles with some ligands, especially when we want to target some tumor, we want to give target for chemotherapy, or when there is we need to target some virus vectors. All these things we can do. This can be used even in for nanoparticle technique. So non-target contrast agent is what we commonly do. That means we don't target any agent, just we'll give the contrast wherever we want to see the agent, whichever organ we want to see, just we'll keep the probe there, then we can see. Whereas in case of targeted contrast agents, the contrast agents which will bind to a ligand, which will be particularly picked up by the receptor for that ligand, which is present on the tissue. Suppose if you want to deliver the drug to the prostate, then we attach a ligand to the microbubble, which will be picked up only by the prostatic tissue, because the receptor for this ligand will be there on the prostate. That means this contrast will directly go to the level of prostate and it will act there. That is the meaning of targeted contrast agent ultrasound. So in this case, this is the prostate. They will not be in B mode. There is nothing is seen here. Whereas in case of CUS, after 28 seconds, we can see there is hyperenhancement. So the same thing, we can see the RCC lesion with clearly we can see even a pseudo capsule in CUS. This is a case of renal oncocytoma where we can see even clear spoke wheel appearance even on ultrasound also. You can see here clear spoke wheel appearance even on ultrasound CUS. This is an image. This is known as cystosonography. That is, this is an alternative to MCUG study. The same like MCUG, we give contrast agents. The contrast agent air bubbles will be picked up here. We can see the reflex here. Even we can use this is an alternative to MCUG. So use of target agents, as I already told, we can target some of the inflammatory tissues. We can with the help of a drug, or we can even treat the thrombolysis in cardiac patient. We can use antithrombotic agents which are targeted directly to the heart level. These agents, drugs will go directly to the level of thrombus and they will act there. This can even use for treatment of cancers. As already told, we can target like VEGF. The ligands can be targeted like VEGF. Wherever VEGF is there, they will go and act there. Even for drug delivery, gene therapy, already told. So there are adverse reactions. These are adverse reactions mainly because of wherever the microbubble goes, there occurs a cardiac reaction. It may even go to systemic circulation, cardiovascular effect, digestive tract, musculoskeletal system, CNS. Wherever the microbubble goes, there are chance of reaction. These contrast studies, enhanced studies, not so popular as compared to CT or MRI, hence used less commonly, and the reactions also reported very less. There are some systemic features like headache, hypersensitivity. In CVS, there is hypertension. In digestive tract, there is nausea. In CNS, there is dizziness. All the features which are non-specific features. Adverse reactions all are non-specific reactions. So advantages of contrast ultrasound is there is no risk of radiation. It is very cost effective, widely available, but not so popular. Since microbubbles generate strong signals, even low IV contrast dosage is sufficient. So disadvantages are it will not long last in circulation. Ultrasound will produce heat. So continuous monitoring is required. So microbubbles, if they are destroyed, they will cause microvascular rupture and hemolysis they will cause. And when we are targeting with some ligands, these ligands may be immunogenic also. So the take home message here is adverse reaction to contrast agents are very common, but severe reactions are very rare. The most severe reactions are mainly because of high osmolar agents. Delayed reactions are mainly seen with isoosmolar agents. So the best means to prevent all the reaction is to prevent from occurring. So identification of patients who are at risk for adverse reaction and minimizing the risk, or if possible, try use alternate diagnostic technique is most important. Clinicians should be clear in investigational protocols to avoid unnecessary radiation exposure. That means we should be very clear in ordering investigation. If we want to see only ureter or bladder, then we can advise CT urography with bladder and ureter. Then they will eliminate all the arterial phase, venous phase. They will concentrate morely on ureter and bladder. If you want to see only the kidneys, then we can clearly tell them the CT, triple phase CT without delayed images. Then they will concentrate more on kidneys only. Then there is less chance of contrast reaction, less chance of radiation exposure too. That is the importance. The clinician, whoever is ordering the investigation, he should have a clear clarity of which investigation should order, and he should have all the basic information regarding patient general condition, his comorbidities, which contrast agent should be used, which treatment investigation should be ordered. So, and there should be equipment and drugs should be available to fight with all the life-threatening reactions which are occurring because of the contrast agents. And these equipment should be available in all the centers where these iodine agents are used. So before this is a, for practical going student, this is a commonly asked question: various effective doses of radiation exposure because of various agents. So with X-ray KV, it is 0.7 to 1.1, IBU 1.5 to 3.5, standard CT abdomen or standard CT pelvis 5 to 10 millisieverts. Standard dose CT urography, it is almost 3 times that of a standard CT, 10 to 30 millisieverts exposure. When we do low dose protocol, ultra low dose protocol, it is very less exposure. When we do diuretic scan, it is 2. Just try to remember these things if possible. Thank you very much for your patient listening.